These eyes, I can't see a damn thing. Where the hell did everybody go? I can't even see my feet. Yeah, was that 6 shots or only 5?
There are voices that belong to one person only. And then there's the voice of Clint Eastwood. A sound so specific, so instantly placeable, that the moment someone drops into that low, sandpaper whisper, an entire room reacts before a single recognizable line is even spoken. It isn't loud. It isn't theatrical. It's the opposite of almost every other iconic Hollywood voice, which is exactly why it's so hard to fake and so irresistible to try. Over the last several decades, comedians, actors, talk show hosts, and everyday impressionists with nothing but a phone camera have all taken their shot at capturing it. Some get close. A rare few nail it so completely that you'd swear the man himself had walked into the room. This is a look at what makes the Eastwood impression the holy grail of celebrity impersonation, and why so many people keep trying to chase it. Most impressions live or die on exaggeration. A big laugh, a distinctive catchphrase, an unmistakable physical tic. These are gifts to a mimic. Eastwood offers almost none of that. His performances, especially in his later decades as both actor and director, are built on restraint. He doesn't shout to be intimidating. He doesn't need wild gestures to command a scene. Instead, everything is compressed. A narrowed eye, a pause that lasts just slightly too long, a sentence delivered so quietly that everyone leans in to hear it. That restraint is precisely what makes the impression so difficult. Anyone can shout a tough guy line and get a cheap laugh. Recreating Eastwood means recreating silence, weight, and control, qualities that don't translate easily into a 30-second bit. The performers who succeed aren't just doing an impression of a voice. They're doing an impression of presence itself. That a much taller order, and it's why the impressionists who actually pull it off tend to become minor legends in their own right, passed around online for years after the original clip aired. Vocal coaches and dialect experts who study the Eastwood sound generally point to a few consistent ingredients. First, there's a register. Eastwood speaks from a noticeably lower pitch than his natural conversational voice, achieved partly through relaxed vocal cords and partly through breath control. Second, there's a texture, a gravel rasp that suggests decades of cigarettes, dust, and hard living, whether or not that's literally true the person doing the impression. Third, and perhaps most important, is the pacing. Eastwood rarely rushes a line. Words arrive with space between them, almost as if each one costs something to produce. Put those 3 elements together, low pitch, gravel, and unhurried pacing, and you have the skeleton of the impression. But skeletons aren't enough. The performers who go from pretty good to genuinely uncanny add a 4th ingredient: physicality. The slight squint, the stillness of the jaw, the way the head tilts just a few degrees before response, as though weighing whether the other person is even worth answering. Without that physical anchor, even a perfect vocal impression can feel like it's missing its body. Eastwood impressions didn't start with viral video clips. They go back nearly as far as the stardom itself. By the time he had cemented his reputation as the steely drifter of the spaghetti western era and the no-nonsense detective of the following decade, his voice and mannerisms had already become cultural shorthand. Comedy stages and late-night sketch shows throughout the 70s and 80s leaned on that shorthand constantly, because audiences didn't need an introduction. They already knew the character being referenced the second an impressionist narrowed their eyes and dropped their voice half an octave. What's interesting is how the impression has evolved alongside Eastwood's own career. Early impressionists leaned almost entirely on the gunslinger persona: squared shoulders, a hand hovering near an imaginary holster, a few iconic lines delivered with maximum grit. As Eastwood moved into directing and took on more understated, weathered roles in his later films, the impression shifted too. It became less about tough guy bravado and more about that quiet, watchful authority, the sense of a man who has seen everything and is no longer interested in proving it to anyone. That evolution matters, because it shows the impression isn't static. It's not just one bit that's been repeated for 50 years. It's a living piece of pop culture shorthand that impressionists keep updating to match the version of Eastwood that's culturally dominant at any given moment. The comedy circuit legends. Long before viral clips and video platforms, professional impressionists built entire careers partly on the strength of their celebrity voices, and Eastwood was reliably one of the most requested. Impressionists of that generation would often describe him as a closer, the kind of impression you save for near the end of the set, because it reliably gets the biggest reaction in the room. There's something about the anticipation of it. Audiences know it's coming the moment a performer starts talking about cowboys or squints meaningfully at the crowd, and the release of laughter or applause when the voice finally drops in is almost Pavlovian. Radio and television further amplified this effect. A strong Eastwood bit could travel from a comedy club stage to a late-night broadcast to a syndicated rerun, reaching audiences who might never have seen the original impressionist perform live. That repetition baked the idea of the Eastwood voice into the broader cultural imagination even for people who hadn't seen many of his films. The impression became, in a strange way, as recognizable as the source material itself. Perhaps the most fascinating subset of Eastwood impressions comes not from professional impressionists, but from actors who've actually worked with him. There's something uniquely funny and a little bit daring about watching someone who stood across from Eastwood on set, taken his direction, and absorbed his rhythms firsthand, turn around and use all that insider knowledge for comic effect on a late-night couch. These impressions tend to hit differently because they're layered with specificity that an outsider simply couldn't invent. An actor who has spent months on an Eastwood-directed set doesn't just know what he sounds like. They know how he paces a rehearsal, how he responds when a take goes wrong, how little he says compared to most directors, and how much weight that scarcity of words carries. When that kind of insider detail gets folded into an impression, it stops being a simple caricature and becomes something closer to affectionate reportage. The audience isn't just laughing at a voice. They're getting a glimpse behind a curtain of what it's actually like to work with one of Hollywood's most famously economical directors. It's also a small, low-risk way for actors to publicly needle someone they clearly respect. Because impressions tend to be so obviously admiring rather than mean-spirited. They read as a kind of inside joke shared between colleagues rather than mockery, and audiences pick up on that warmth even as they're laughing. There's an entirely different flavor of Eastwood impression that comes from within his own family. When someone who shares his bloodline, his last name, and quite literally some of his facial structure attempts a voice, the effect lands differently than any outside impressionist could manage. It's not really an impression at all in traditional sense. It's closer to a kind of inherited mannerism, something absorbed simply by growing up around a man rather than studied and rehearsed the way an outside performer would approach it. Audiences tend to respond to this version with a mix of amusement and genuine curiosity because it offers something no stand-up bit can, a peek at where the persona might have come from in the first place. Is the squint a performance choice, or is it just a family trait that happened to translate spectacularly well onto film? Impressions from within the family raise that question without ever quite answering it, which is part of what makes them so compelling to watch. Not every great Eastwood bit is about the voice at all. A surprisingly rich vein of material comes from actors describing and acting out what it's actually like to be directed by him. Eastwood has built a reputation, whether mythologized or entirely accurate, for running some of the most efficient sets in the business. Minimal takes, minimal notes, and a level of trust placed in his actors that can be as unnerving as it is liberating. Performers describing this dynamic often end up doing something closer to a one-person scene than a traditional impression. They'll narrate the tension of an early take, mimic the quiet non-reaction Eastwood is famous for, and then land the punchline on just how few words it apparently takes for him to either approve a performance or send everyone back to do it again. The comedy here isn't really about mocking Eastwood. It's about capturing